Hello and welcome everybody to Frisella's All Around the Yard. I am your host, Tony Frisella Jr. We have with us guest today, Justin Keay. And Justin, you are the field specialist in horticulture at the University of Missouri, St. Louis and St. Charles County Extension, correct?
That's correct. You got it.
Awesome. And Justin, man, thanks for making the time. We've been having a lot of fun with a lot of great guests, and you were recommended to us by Tamara, who's been on with us a couple of times now. Always a great conversation with Tamara. So I'm excited to jump into this conversation with you about soil, because this is one that my father has absolutely, when we had a radio show, it was literally almost every other show, he was talking about soils. It wasn't soils, it was drainage. The two kind of go hand in hand, but soils is a crucial part of the whole conversation. So I guess, I used to have a professor at the University of Missouri in Columbia. I can't remember his name, but I remember he used to always warn us the first day of class. He said, if you call it dirt, you're kicked out. Dirt is dead. Soil is alive, or something along those lines. So it was kind of funny, but to the common person, they're like, wait, what?
Yeah. Dirt is what you sweep dirt off the floor and knock it off your boots, and then soil is what we grow stuff in.
Yeah, and a lot of people are like, well, I don't understand the difference, and so I guess we can kind of start there. Is what is soil?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a mystifying thing to a lot of folks, because we know more, honestly, about the cosmos, the stars and the planets, than we understand what's right underneath our feet. At its essence, soil is a couple things. It's a combination of mineral particles, so sand, silt, and clay. Every soil across the world is classified based on how much sand, silt, and clay are in a given soil. Soil is also microorganisms. So we have, bacteria and fungi, things that you need a microscope to see. We have smaller arthropods, insects and worms that are visible with the naked eye. Soil is also organic matter. So it's the dead things that once lived on that soil, whether it's plant material or animals. As those organisms die and decay, the nutrients and the carbon compounds are incorporated into the soil into what we call organic matter. And the other thing soil is it's voids, it's space. So in a well-structured soil, 50% of that volume is space. And that space, depending on moisture, will be filled with either air, oxygen, or water. So, you have a big rainfall event, those pores fill up with water, some of it drains out and evaporates, and then some of it's water and some of it's air. So that's at its essence what soil really is.
So I do want to back up just 1 second so our listeners know who you are. Can you give us a little bit of your background real fast?
Sure. So I've been with University of Missouri Extension as a horticulture specialist for about 3 years. There's about 12 or 14 of us around the state. I kind of came into this work through a long road. I studied environmental science and policy in undergraduate, got done with that, and then kind of really just got interested in sustainable landscape design. Studied horticulture for a while at Merrimack, and then ended up starting my own vegetable farm up here in St. Louis County. So I ran that vegetable farm for about 7 years, just learned a ton over those years about managing plants and managing soils, and realized that, I wanted to get into education. And so enrolled in a master's program in sustainable agriculture at Lincoln University. And so worked there as a research assistant for a couple years, got to work on some really cool projects with soils and cover crops, no-till vegetable systems, integrated pest management, biological control of insects. I got certified to do organic farm inspections, so I did that for a summer. And then when I completed my master's, I ended up finding this job with University of Missouri Extension. So definitely been a soil geek and a vegetable connoisseur for quite some time.
So with all that experience, seeing all these different areas and all these different places, different organic farms, I guess, what is the most stark differences you've seen between traditional farming and or you call it the commercial farming and the organic farming?
Well, so organic farming is regulated when we talk about the USDA organic certified farm. So they have to follow certain rules. Those rules involve use of inputs. So whether it's fertilizer, insecticide, herbicide, everything that goes on an organic farm has to be approved for use by your organic certifier. I think when we think more broadly about organic gardening and organic farming versus what we might consider conventional farming, there's more interest and attention paid to things like soil organic matter, cover crops, soil health, as well as, just managing the insects and the diseases in an ecological way. So as opposed to maybe just relying on insecticides and fungicides, there's a little bit more prevention and what we call cultural control. So, maybe on an organic farm, they might plant something like mustard greens prior to a crop. And there are certain types of mustard greens that actually suppress diseases. So what really excites me about organic farming and organic gardening is just thinking about these ecological connections and how we can manage those systems in a way using plants and other organisms to support the function of the system.
So take everything you said and let's think about me and my 4x8 raised planters that I have. So I deal with a lot of, I'm all gung-ho for the first, 5-6 weeks. I see some things sprouting up, great, beautiful. And then the season really hits and I've not paid much attention to my garden and it looks like more weeds than anything else. Is there anything organically that I could look at that would help maybe really promote the soil in those instances without trying to feed it? We use a lot of organic fertilizers, not typically my garden, I don't do a lot in my garden, but is there anything from an organic standpoint that would be beneficial to maybe helping the plants outgrow or outcompete the weeds or any of those kind of things?
Well, that's the $1 million question, right? So, fertilizing your plants appropriately does encourage, vigorous plant growth. So that can, in some circumstances, help kind of outpace the weeds, if you will. But, weeds are always going to have the upper hand. That's what their niche is. They grow quickly. They set seed quickly. That's ecologically how they've, been able to reproduce themselves for so long. They like a lot of disturbance. So, a couple things in terms of weed management. So a lot of folks till the garden in the beginning of the year to manage weeds. In some instances, using things like cardboard or a black tarp to actually kill all the weeds that are there. There's what's called a critical weed-free period. So if we can manage weeds in the first couple weeks after we transplant or our seeds germinate, for those first 2 to 3, 4 weeks after that period, our plants can grow big and deal with some weed pressure. If we do a good job of controlling weeds early on, the rest of the season is a lot easier. We've had a lot of challenges with excess moisture this year, so that can make it hard to get in there and weed, and it's going to make the weeds grow a lot faster. So
why is it important for obviously for people that are growing crops like us with our fields and also the farmers, but why would it be important for an average homeowner to know what actually makes their soil, how their soil is made up?
Yeah, so in terms of your soil, the nutrients that are in your soil, the organic matter that's in your soil, you're not really going to know what's there and what's not there if you don't test. You might have an idea, well, these plants kind of grow well, these plants don't grow well. But without that soil analysis, you're not going to know what nutrients are there, if you need to add those nutrients, or maybe you don't need to add those nutrients. So you're kind of flying blind when you're applying fertilizer without a soil test. You're kind of hoping that it's the right thing, but not really knowing if it's what your garden needs. We see a lot of times folks who have small garden plots, they add so much compost that they raise their soil pH, which can negatively affect plant growth. You can get to a point where you have so much organic matter, it starts causing nutrient imbalances and affects calcium uptake and things like that. So yeah, without a soil test, you're just kind of guessing.
So that is actually pretty interesting. So, there's all these soil mixes that we buy on landscape. The most typical one is a 70-30 mix. So 30% topsoil, 30% compost, organic matter. For a lot of these blanket blends that people are making, obviously you still want to know what's going on in the soil. Where we like to get is a lot of new construction where the soil is completely compacted. Get in there, take out anywhere between 12 and 18 inches of the existing compacted clay soil, spread it somewhere else in the site, then disc up or tear up, rip up the subgrade, and then dump in our good soil. So we try to break up all the hard pan and get that soil to break down to there where the roots can start to push and start to break up some of the soil. I think something that's always fascinated me was the Great Plains and all the grasses that are out in the Great Plains. And nobody understands how beneficial some of these native grasses and native plants are, and how far down those root systems extend. They don't see that it's basically like, the duck on water, where it looks calm on top, but the feet are just churning away underneath. A lot of these grasses are doing the same thing. I guess, is there anything you could chime in on that as far as, those kind of benefits of certain plants to help the soil?
Yeah, absolutely. So I got to do a lot of really cool work with cover crops in my graduate thesis. So, you bring up a good point. Plants improve soil in a lot of different ways. Now, when we talk about the Great Plains, for thousands of years, they were covered with these tall grasses. Those grasses would break down and decompose, and they would build up this thick, rich, black topsoil. And that's why the Great Plains, were so productive when they first turned those soils in, because it was just this amazing system that created the soil. Now, we can't replicate that in our own gardens, but cover crops can do so much to improve soils. So we have nitrogen fixing cover crops like cowpeas, hairy vetch, and clover. Those plants are actually capable of taking nitrogen out of the atmosphere and converting it into a form that plants can utilize. So that's just one way. We also have cover crops. A lot of folks are starting to use called these radishes, these no-till radishes, daikon radishes. There's a couple different names for them, but basically they have an extremely thick and really big taproot. So those radishes are really great to plant in the fall after you take something out, like say tomatoes. You plant those radishes, they cover the soil surface. A lot of our spring weed seeds, they actually require a light trigger in the fall to germinate in the spring. So when you plant something like radishes, it covers the soil surface, keeps the light off of the soil surface and the weed seeds. And then when winter comes, those radishes will die, they'll freeze, kill, but they leave this deep channel, and they can do a good job of help breaking up the hard pan. And then when you create all those channels, whether it's a thick taproot from a radish or smaller roots from clover, when those die, they create channels for organisms to move. They create channels for water to percolate. And anytime a cover crop degrades, those roots will give nutrients back to the soil. So we can't replicate the Great Plains system, but we can use things like annual cover crops in a vegetable garden or in a landscape to improve the soil for sure.
So let me try and put a couple things together here. So if we don't till our gardens because we don't want to disrupt too much of the organisms, and we want to use a cover crop to try to minimize, the weed activity. So if we plant the radishes or something along those lines with the clover in the fall and have it cover in, it dies off in the wintertime, it lays flat. And then instead of tilling it, we literally just go in and pluck in seeds in the garden. That may be a way to, it's not going to cure the weeds, obviously, but be a way to potentially suppress some of it while at the same time keeping the beneficial nutrients and organisms in place in the soil.
Yeah, definitely. So I think, anytime you start with cover crops, it's best to start on a small scale, for your first season. So yeah, if you want to try cover crops out, it's always good to try it out on a small section of the garden in the first year to just get familiar with it. The three easiest cover crops to start off with are the radishes, winter peas, and spring oats. Those are all what we call winter kill cover crops. So you plant them in the fall. They will freeze and die about 20 degrees or so. And then when it gets to be springtime to plant, I would recommend go ahead 2 weeks before you put your seeds or your transplants in, use cardboard or tarps to smother any little weeds that have come up. Then you can plant right in. Now, you're still going to have to do weed maintenance, but we've done a couple things. You've covered the soil in the fall. That's going to prevent a lot of those spring weeds from germinating. We've reduced the disturbance, so we're not tilling. Whenever we till, we bring weed seeds to the surface. And then we have a little residue on the soil surface that'll help smother weeds out. Now, there's all kinds of cool stuff that's happening with no-till vegetable production. Folks using things like cereal rye and hairy vetch combined together. Those ones you need to kill though. So a little more complicated, but maybe after a couple of years of playing around with it, that could be something you go to as well, where you're really growing a thick layer of mulch, which would be good for something like tomatoes or eggplant.
Gotcha. Awesome. So if people are going to test their soil to see what they need to put into it, how do they go about doing that?
So a soil test is pretty easy to do. If you're thinking about testing your soil, you want to do separate samples for different gardens. So if you have a vegetable garden, you probably manage that one way. Maybe you have an ornamental landscape bed on the front of the house, you manage a different way. And then you're going to manage your lawn a different way as well. So if you wanted to test all three of those, you would want to do separate sampling. So if I was going to take a soil sample in my vegetable garden, I would take 8 to 10 subsamples. So we don't want to just take one little shovelful and send it to the lab. It's not going to really be representative of the entire soil. So we just get a little hand trowel, cut a little slice about 6 inches deep, toss it in a bucket, do that about 8 to 10 times. And then you just let that dry for a couple days, get any grass or leaves or wood chips out of there, and then mix that together thoroughly. And then you can take 1 cup to your local extension office. We'll send it off to our lab in Columbia. When you drop the sample off, they'll ask you, what are you getting this tested for? So if it's a lawn, they'll ask you, is this for a fescue or a zoysia lawn? If it's for a vegetable garden, or maybe it's for some ornamental plants like boxwoods, azaleas, or something like that.
So that brings up another good, you should talk about landscape beds, ornamental landscape beds. Obviously, it's my world. I guess, it's the same thing with vegetables. You want to have good yield out of whatever it is you're growing. You want to have good, nutritious vegetables. You want this time to go for naught, and then you have something that doesn't taste good, it's bland, it's off color, it doesn't fully mature. But on the landscape side of things, is there anything different than a garden that you would be concerned about, or just talk to me about that a little bit?
Yeah, so whether it's a vegetable garden or ornamentals, I think a big thing that folks don't necessarily think about all the time is pH, right? So we all know that plants need nutrients to grow, but plants also need a certain pH to grow, and different plants have different pH preferences. I often get folks who have planted a bunch of azaleas, they're not necessarily growing very well, and that is directly tied to soil pH. So things like azaleas, things like blueberries, they really prefer an acidic soil where nutrients like iron are highly readily available, right? So, you could spend a pretty good chunk of change installing a big row of azaleas. And if you don't do a soil test and know what the pH is and adjust it to where it needs to be, they're just never really going to thrive, right? And when you have plants that aren't thriving, they don't have the nutrients they need, they don't have the pH they need, they're going to be more susceptible to both disease and insect pressure. So, just like people, if we feed our plants what they need, get them growing healthy, they're that much better able to deal with pest pressure. Now, it's not a miracle cure. Even healthy plants can get diseases and suffer from insect pressure. But yeah, I think pH is a huge one, right? I think the other thing to think about, if you have a garden bed that's had a lot of compost, whether it's a vegetable garden or an ornamental bed, you might have very good levels of phosphorus and potassium, and you don't need to add any more of those. So a lot of times folks will apply like a 10-10 or what we call a complete fertilizer. But you really might be in a situation with a well-managed bed where you really just need nitrogen. And if you add too much phosphorus and potassium over time and create excess levels, it actually can affect things like iron uptake. So I have seen a couple circumstances where phosphorus was so high, like no plants could really grow there because they just could not fix iron from the soil. So those are just a couple things to think about there.
So we talked about the cover crops and some things to do to prevent weeds, the pH. What about managing and maintaining soil? So, I mean, with the test, obviously, when you start, you got to know what you're even starting with first. But, you know, we touched a little bit on some of the fertilizers, on the complete fertilizers that they have out there. But is there anything special, any special steps? Is there any special circumstances that people should be aware of when they're trying to maintain the health of their soil?
Well, I mean, I think the soil test, so the important thing to know is the soil test comes with recommendations. Whatever plant you select, you will receive pH recommendations, soil fertility recommendations for each plant. So, you know, like you said, that's a great baseline to start with. And I really encourage people, you know, every 2 to 3 years to get your soil tested. So, you know, there can be changes in the soil over time. So if you got a soil test report and it said your soil is acidic, you need to add 50 pounds of lime per 1,000 square feet. Well, you don't want to necessarily keep adding that every year because you can elevate that pH to too high. So, you know, maintaining your soil, getting your soil tested every couple years, you know, making sure your nutrients and your pH are tracking in the right direction. You know, organic matter can be necessary. You raised a really good point. When you come into these new home sites, that topsoil's gone. You're dealing with, you know, subsoil that sod got thrown on top. That's a tough situation. That is going to require some more maintenance. You know, you're going to have to build up your organic matter levels, improve drainage, and possibly add some lime or fertilizer. So, yeah, I think, you know, testing every 2 to 3 years is a good practice for sure. You know, the thing about liming our soils, most Missouri soils are acidic. When we add lime, we raise the pH, but that dissipates over time. So even if you added lime 5 years ago, soil will revert to what we call its native soil pH. So if you ask somebody who's growing corn or soybeans, for instance, they're applying lime every so many years. They know they have to do that. So maintaining soil pH, maintaining fertility, those are all important steps.
So I read I can't remember the name of the book. It was like the organic lawn maintenance handbook or something like that. And one of the things that was always talk about, and again, I don't know all the validity to it, but you know, certain weeds in your yard are an indicator of certain deficiencies in the soil. Is there any truth to that?
There is, yeah. There is some truth to that. And there's definitely been research done on those types of things. So like, I'll give you just one example. Clover, we talked about that as a cover crop. Clover is capable of fixing atmospheric nitrogen. So if you have a lawn where it seems like the past couple of years, clover has just went crazy and the grass isn't doing so well, it's probably a symptom of nitrogen deficiency. Because even in a nitrogen deficient soil, that clover can go gangbusters because it's just grabbing nitrogen from the air. So yeah, I mean, there are plants that are indicative of certain nutrient deficiencies, and clover is just one of them.
Sounds like my yard then. Well, is there anything I missed that you feel is important for people to know when it comes to soil?
Well, I think a couple things. You know, I see this very often. You know, when folks have small garden beds, raised beds, vegetable gardens, there can be this tendency to kind of just add a little bit too much of everything. So, you know, we talk about the
like
benefits.
My dad and I, yeah, a little heavy-handed.
If you've added too much compost over the years, you can get, you know, up above 7.5. So that's one thing. you get to a certain point, you really don't need any organic matter because you've done a great job of supplying it already. In those circumstances, you might just need a little bit of nitrogen fertilizer. You probably, in a garden that's been there for a long time, you probably have adequate levels of phosphorus, adequate levels of potassium, but you might need to lower your pH a little bit and then do some supplemental nitrogen application. A couple other things. If you're using a raised bed mix and it has a lot of uncomposted woody materials in there, that can lead in the short term to a little bit of a nitrogen deficiency. So sometimes a little extra nitrogen fertilizer is a good thing for the first year or so of that raised bed mix. What else? pH is important. If you're going to plant something like blueberries or azaleas, you're going to invest a lot of time and money and energy in getting that planting established. Do a soil test about 6 months before, because most of the time we're going to have to add sulfur, and it's going to take about 6 months for that to interact with the soil and lower the pH. So, the more time we can give ourselves to do that, you're just going to set the plants up for success in that situation. The other thing is the soil test report will give you recommendations on how much fertilizer to apply. You can burn your plants if you apply too much fertilizer. I think everybody's probably done that once or twice. The other thing is just this, thinking about environmental sustainability and being a responsible steward, of the land that you're managing. If we're applying fertilizer that we don't need to our lawn and gardens, that stuff can end up running off into the sewers and into the streams, and you get these things called algal blooms. We probably have all seen a pond like that where the algae just blows up. When that algae decomposes, it takes its oxygen out of the water, and that can kill fish and other aquatic organisms. So, getting your soil tested, applying the appropriate amount of fertilizer, that's a good part of being an environmental steward for sure.
Well, the phosphorus is what causes a lot of the algae, correct?
Yeah, phosphorus and nitrogen can cause algal blooms. Folks might have heard of the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. That's this big area in the ocean where there's very little aquatic life, and that's a direct result of the Mississippi River. So, the Mississippi and Missouri River watersheds drain a lot of land, and big agriculture tends to get the blame for this pretty often, and agriculture definitely contributes to fertilizer runoff. Homeowners, though, also contribute greatly to this. I've worked for landscape design companies before and saw algae growing in the street gutter, right? There's just so much fertilizer on the lawns. It was running off, growing algae there, and then a lot of that was going into the water. So yeah, soil test the best way for you to know how much to apply so you're not over applying. I think everybody wants to be a good steward of the planet, and this is a great way to get started on that.
I've been by a bunch of HOAs, and where all the grass is around the pond. You look at the pond, it's pretty evident the only place for the water to go is across the lawn and into the water. So yeah, I remember vaguely an example, something like that was given to me several years ago. So, so if people want to find out more about soil testing, and or you've got an online Soils 101, it's at the extension.missouri.edu.
Yeah, we do. Yep, we have a Soils 101 class. I have a class basically every month through October. It's online via Zoom. It's an hour and a half long class. So yeah, you can go to extension.missouri.edu and search Soils 101 to come up with that class. So anybody statewide, I guess anybody really could register for that Zoom. Gives a great overview of soils. If you've had a soils class before, it'll kind of be a refresher of some of the terminology. And then we'll kind of take a look at some soil test reports. We'll talk about some different fertilizer options that folks might want to select. So, if you're interested in learning more about soil, this class I think it's a great place for folks to start.
Yeah, I want to just reaffirm that is when we meet with clients, my grandfather said it, my dad said it. There's two things we look at before we look at the cool stuff. How's your drainage? What is your drainage? And then what is your soil like? Because without those two things being right, you're wasting your money. You might as well throw your money down the drain with the phosphorus and the nitrogen. So it's just you've got to do the work. You can build it's like building a house. You can either do the 2x4s, you can do 2x6s behind the walls, but once it's done, it's going to cost you a fortune to fix it later. Just set things up right, build the foundation of your landscape and your gardens the right way first. And then everything moving forward is so much less labor intensive, it's less stress, it's less time, it's less questions, it's less mitigation, all those kind of things. So can anybody find you on social media?
I am not on social media. So sorry.
You're good. You're good. So anybody listening, we're going to close this out. Feel free to find this YouTube video again on YouTube. You'll be able to see it on our social media at Frisella Nursery, both on Instagram and on Facebook. And then if you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe, share with a friend. Yeah, go ahead, Justin.
I just want to make one more plug, and I guess
it.
maybe you can drop this stuff into the YouTube videos.
Yeah.
We have a weekly MU home horticulture town hall. So it's from 12 to 1. It's once a week during the growing season. And it's once a month during the off season. But we basically have a bunch of horticulturalists from across the state. We come together, we talk about the questions that we're getting from homeowners, the issues that we're seeing in the landscape, talk about solutions to those problems. We talk about weather. We have a weather report from our MU state climatologist that's really oriented towards growers. We talk about, garden friend or garden foe, different insects that are out there. But if you looking to enhance your gardening knowledge, that town hall is really cool. You can submit questions beforehand, and we'll make sure that link gets in below the YouTube video.
That's awesome. And we're definitely going to share that, because that's something that, homeowners are constantly asking questions about this, that, and the other thing. And a lot of times, we're also, we want to double check ourselves. We go to the extension and just make sure that our information is correct. So no, I really appreciate that. Appreciate everything you guys are doing, because it's definitely helping everybody that we had the privilege of serving have more fun, more success with their gardens and landscape. So thank you very much, man. I appreciate making the time.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. It's been a lot of fun. I appreciate the invitation.
Absolutely. Talk to you soon.